listener production.
Hey, Helen Smith here. Welcome to The Briefing. BookTok took over our feeds this year, serving up everything from smut and fantasy to crime thrillers and debut authors. But as we head into the new year, what's next for BookTok?
You can really curate an algorithm for yourself that allows you to connect with people from your own communities or people from marginalised or underrepresented communities that have these relationships of solidarity with each other.
So what's the best way to train your algorithm to help you find your next favourite summer read? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with the Listener News team. It's Tuesday, the 30th of December.
Morning, I'm Lauren Howarth. Concerns an independent review of the Bondi Beach terror attack won't give grieving families the answers they need. The PM yesterday doubled down on his refusal to hold a royal commission into the tragedy. Shayna Gutnick's dad died in the attack. She's told News Corp the review won't be as transparent or cohesive, and Australians deserve to know the truth. While there's been a change to how victims will be honoured in Sydney on New Year's Eve, an image of a menorah will now be projected onto the Harbour Bridge instead of a dove with the word peace. Dozens of holidaymakers will be flown back to Australia after an Aussie cruise ship ran aground off the coast of PNG. And communities in parts of Queensland are bracing for further flooding. More record rains expected to hit the state's outback and far north, while in WA, tropical cyclone Hayley is forecast to make landfall in the next 24 hours. The ICC has rated the controversial MCG pitch for the Boxing Day test as unsatisfactory. It's the second lowest possible rating, with the pitch ruled to favour bowlers too much, with too many wicket-taking opportunities for either seam or spin. The MCG's been given one demerit point by the ICC, which will stay on record for 5 years. And Nathan Lyon has been ruled out for the next 3 months following his hamstring injury during the third Ashes test.
Thanks to the Listener Newsroom for those headlines. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on how to maximise BookTok. To give you a bit of background, BookTok is a community on TikTok where users share and create content about books. And in 2025, the hashtag BookTok truly entered the zeitgeist, platforming new authors, sparking controversy, and even reshaping how book sales and the way the publishing industry operates. Evelyn Araluen is a Goorie and Koori author and teacher whose debut poetry collection, Drop Bear, won the 2022 Stella Prize. Evelyn, how would you describe BookTok?
Oh, it depends on the audience I'm thinking about. If I'm trying to be supportive and encouraging people to be engaging in online literary communities, I'd talk about all of the positives of BookTok, the way that it can help foster new audiences and introduce people to new works or, underappreciated works and authors and styles of writing, that just aren't in the mainstream. Like I would be so celebratory and really encouraging of all of the benefits and positives that come with adding this online technological digital community to our literary spaces. If I were being honest or kind of talking in more of an industry kind of professional context, I'd really caution people about investing too much of their sense of worth as either an author or as a reader or a commentator into those spaces and communities. Everything being driven by algorithms can really undermine the value of individual works or forms or styles of writing, and it's just so vulnerable to really hostile forms of critique and misuse and misrepresentation. So it can be a really volatile space as well as a really nourishing one.
Do you think BookTok right now reveals the kind of stories that readers are really craving? Or is it, like you mentioned there, is it algorithms at play? Is there something else?
I think it's worth clarifying, how many different BookToks there are and how those different forms become curated, not just by the way that we, might encounter, certain accounts and might try and engage with certain creators. And then that, formulates this kind of individualized algorithm that you access that ostensibly is kind of framed towards your tastes and might help introduce you to, new creators that'll help broaden those tastes. But we've got to be honest about how much sponsorship and advertising can go into some of these videos and algorithms and can really attempt to skew audience interactions and, really undermine kind of the integrity of those responses.
Now, you're an award-winning writer. Has social media changed the way that you write?
I feel like I encountered social media at such a formative time in my life, but one where I had already kind of developed a lot of the critical thinking skills, and I'd learned to love literature completely outside of these online worlds that now are so constitutive of the way that pretty much everybody encounters literature and especially new writing. So I've seen it change the way that I interact with authors or different communities that are formed around different works. And I feel like I've lived to see a lot rise and fall, even in my own life. LiveJournal and Blogger were these really important online communities about bringing different readers together to talk about works that were not necessarily being reviewed in, mainstream newspapers or in literary journals. So therefore were pretty much, completely invisible to most audiences. So in the sense that I see social media as an evolution of those communities, I think it can be really positive, and I've got a lot of nostalgia for the way that can help shape your identity as a reader. But it has its pitfalls. I've had many experiences of trolling and cyberbullying and the kind of very strange parasocial attention that you can get when you exist on the internet, even if you're not necessarily out there as like a public brand or anything like that. And I'm not somebody who really intentionally curates my social media to sell the idea of myself as an author. I'm just somebody who exists on the internet. But it's definitely shaped the way that I feel I am interacting with readers. The fact that they are seeing, photos of my dog all of the time, or they're sending me DMs because they've been studying my work in their class and they want to know what this poem means, really does change the idea, I think, of what an author is in the 21st century. And I, of course, have internalized some anxieties about that.
How have you found your work being studied in a classroom and then also being pulled apart online? How does that work when it comes with an author and your next project that you might work on?
It is really bizarre, I'll be honest. I'd encountered, I think, some of the more negative ways that audiences can interact with work, especially by marginalised or authors from communities less represented previously in my life. So I was a witness to these attacks on Ellen van Neven after their work was used in an HSC exam a couple of years ago. And that was so volatile to have thousands of students sending messages and emails and trying to make contact with an author that they were really upset with, as if Ellen's poem, was some kind of personal attack on them and not just something that was set for them to study in an exam. And so I was really wary when I started hearing from students and young people about my own work, and felt really, I guess, like a bit preemptively defensive of my own privacy or of my own intentions as an author. And it took me a little while to accustom myself to that experience, because I was cautious about the idea that my work had fixed meanings that could be interpreted or distilled, and that it was something that I wanted people writing about. Much less, writing about and then checking with me as if I had the answers for poetic meaning. I guess I've kind of changed my relationship to that experience, though, over the last couple of years. So between Drop Bear, which had a much broader audience than I'd ever intended and had a much younger audience than I had really anticipated. Poetry hadn't really occupied the more accessible and mainstream position that I think it's now really rapidly moving towards in Australian literature in particular. And the impact of what was at the time kind of referred to as this sort of Instagram poetry generation, writers like Rupi Kaur and Wasan Shire having work that was really well circulated and that, kids were sharing on their social media and Tumblr and those sorts of, online communities. I think it really created this appetite for poetry that I hadn't anticipated. And so when the national and a couple of state curriculums started thinking seriously about trying to make sure that students were having access to contemporary poetry and to contemporary Australian poetry, things kind of just accelerated rapidly for the way that my work was being engaged with from young people as students. I heard a lot from teachers. Many teachers would reach out to me and ask for assistance in developing curriculum materials, sometimes nicely and sometimes perhaps not always so nicely. And then, different media would start to approach my work a little differently. I would say there was a noticeable change from feeling like poetry is something that people can respond to and have these deeply personal relationships to, into this assumption, I feel, that needs a little more consideration about the idea that poetry is something that must be interrogated or unpacked, and the affective, emotional relationship we have with it is only one component of what poetry is meant to mean in a classroom setting or, to an audience at a writers' festival. So I think there's a little more work we need to do on the way we circulate creative writing and the reactions we expect people to have to that work. Because to be honest, I'd rather encounter like a young person sharing pictures of my poetry and just talking about how it makes them feel than I would read an essay that they've written about it. And both of those events have occurred quite frequently for me.
So do you think something like BookTok helps or hinders emerging writers?
I think it can absolutely help. Apart from anything else, we can't underestimate the idea of building a community. And I don't think it should be required for authors to have to put themselves out there so visibly, especially given the risks around online security and safety and the way that sometimes parasocial relationships in these spaces can get really out of hand. But I think if you've got this capacity to be reaching out outside of a practice that is often so lonely and isolated, most people work in quite closed and constrained individual environments when they're working on a book. And so connecting with people in an online community or at a writers' festival or at an author event, those are the ways that we actually feel like we do belong to a community. And I think BookTok can have a really powerful role in supporting those spaces and giving authors a sense of collective identity, which is so crucial, not just for your own sense of well-being, but also it helps us organise. It helps us talk about things we really need to be addressing in the industry, like fair wages and remuneration for publishing industry workers, talking about what are appropriate conditions for us all to be working in, talking about the basic working conditions of dignity that everybody should have access to. But unfortunately in the arts, we often assume that people will work for a passion and that they'll be willing to do at least some amount of work unpaid constantly. And so I'm always worried about the amount of investment in terms of time and labour that goes into things like filming videos of you receiving new books or, reviewing every single work that you read so that you can create this archive of content and keep your readers and responders, your audience engaged. And the burden that constantly having to sell your own work can place on an author. So I'm worried that it can get out of hand, but I think at this time, the potential and the benefits are something that really need to be embraced, I would say, especially if you feel comfortable in those spaces. But what we really shouldn't do is create this precedent where if you're not willing to put yourself out there on BookTok and on every form of social media, you just won't get any form of readership or attention. That's going to be a really, really dangerous balance we have to navigate.
Touching on some of the things you said just there, BookTok has also kind of helped propel writers, authors and maybe unknown authors into the spotlight, but it's also leaving others unseen. How do you think algorithms can affect the diversity of voices that actually get heard?
It can be so insidious. On the one hand, you can really curate an algorithm for yourself that allows you to connect with people from your own communities or people from marginalised or underrepresented communities that have these relationships of solidarity with each other. So I see really strong connections and collaborations across BookTok spaces that are really focused on embracing First Nations writers, people of colour and culture and linguistic diversity in Australia. I think there's some really strong networks there that are so supportive and encouraging, but you have to actively go out and curate that algorithm. And these algorithms are often trying to undermine that. So they'll throw works in front of you and like really well-produced videos that might look very homemade and candid and deeply personal from individual creators, but often actually there's no transparency behind who might be behind what looks like a very amateur operation. And we've seen a couple of instances where advertising and sponsorship isn't being appropriately acknowledged or referenced, or people are finding themselves kind of subject to some industry pressure and expectation around what they're meant to be reading and what they're meant to be saying about certain books. So I think social media has been so powerful for a lot of underrepresented communities since it's been around, but you're working against a precedent here that's defined by a market that's then defined by an algorithm that is at its heart interested in getting people to purchase and consume, whether you are, spending your dollars in a bookshop or whether you are spending your time and therefore these seconds and minutes and hours that add up to advertising revenue. We need to be really attentive and ensure that we're going out there and actually looking at and engaging with creators that are being authentic to their own communities and experiences, even if they don't have 20 ring lights and a really fancy camera.
So if someone does want to find a new book or a new author with BookTok going into the break and kind of maximize, I guess, how they can use BookTok and outplay the algorithms almost, how can someone do that? What would your best advice be on how a listener can use BookTok and find authors that might not be the ones being shoved in their faces?
I mean, I'm a big believer in actually just going back to the things that you know that you've enjoyed and connected with. So I had this really lovely experience of wanting to go back and reread some of my favourite novels that had been published well before BookTok and social media were a phenomenon. And I kind of just had this strange desire to see what people said about work that was so important and special to me. And so I would search a couple of names and have a look on TikTok and on YouTube and a couple of other places to see what people would say. And that actually allowed me to connect with some really interesting creators who responded to the same works that I had responded to. And from there, you can actually go and have a look at what they've recommended and what they've enjoyed. And it's just something so simple as it's like asking a mate, for a recommendation. It just happens to be mediated by a digital world. And so, yes, I'm still skeptical that the algorithm is going to try to steer you, away from this, really interesting text that not very many people have read and then suggest something, super oversaturated in the market. But oversaturation isn't always necessarily a bad thing. And in Australia, we have a little bit of a problem of, the tall poppy syndrome. And if somebody gets a bit of an audience, we can be a little bit hostile to it. But I actually think that reading the classics and reading works that have been well circulated is often worth your time. Even if you hate a book that somebody recommends, that's not the fault of the person who's recommended it. It just means that your tastes are a little bit different. So keep reading and keep finding it. Start off with what you know you like and just try and find other people and connect with other people who've enjoyed that too.
Evelyn, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Evelyn Araluen, a Goorie and Koori author and teacher, speaking with me there. And thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. It's a really easy way you can support everything we do here at The Briefing. And you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.